Now, if you're still awake, you're exactly where you're meant to be. Welcome to Mind Bending Mysteries. My name is Tammy, and everything you're about to hear is based on reported details, documented accounts, and the known timeline of the case. Now, some details have been described differently by different sources, and when we talk about motive or psychology, those are possibilities, not confirmed facts. Because here we just don't tell stories, we take a closer look. We question what doesn't feel right, and we try to understand what may be happening beneath the surface. Because mystery without discipline becomes misinformation. Now, tonight we're talking about one of the most unsettling true stories of all. Not because it's the bloodiest, not because it has the biggest twist, but because it plays on something almost everyone fears, the idea of being watched. Not in some loud, obvious way, not by someone who bangs on the door, and not by someone who announces themselves, but by someone you can't see, someone who may be nearby, someone who knows where you live, someone who knows your children, someone who knows when you come and go. And once that kind of fear gets into a house, it changes everything, because a home is supposed to be the place where you let your guard down. And this story is about what happens when that becomes impossible. Now, the story centers on a house at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey. Now, it was a large, older home, a 6-bedroom Dutch colonial that had been built in the early 1900s. And Westfield itself had a reputation as a beautiful, well-off family town. Tree-lined streets, big homes, good schools, the kind of place many people imagine when they think of finally making it. Now, in June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus, they bought the house for a little over $1.3 million. And Maria had grown up in Westfield, so this wasn't just another move for the family. In a lot of ways, it felt personal. It felt like coming home, but on a bigger scale. Now, they had 3 young children, and before they had even fully moved in, the kids were already imagining their life there. Now, that part is important because this was not some rundown place they took a chance on. This was a dream house. And dream houses have a way of becoming nightmares faster than ordinary houses do, because there's a lot more to lose. Now, just 3 days after closing on the home, Derek was at the house doing some painting and checking on renovations before the family moved in. And one night he went outside to check the mailbox, and inside a white envelope addressed in thick handwriting to the new owner. Now, at first it sounded almost friendly, and the letter opened like a welcome. Then it changed. The writer said 657 Boulevard had been the subject of their family for decades. They said their grandfather had watched the house in the 1920s, their father had watched it in the 1960s, and now it was their turn. The house, they said, was approaching its 110th birthday, and they asked, "Do you know what lies in the walls of 657 Boulevard? And why are you here?" And that alone is enough to make most people uneasy. But the part that really changed everything was the way the letter talked about the Broaddus children. The writer referred to them as young blood. They asked whether the old house had been too small for the growing family, or whether it was greed that brought the children there. Then came one of the most disturbing lines in the whole case. Once the writer knew the children's names, they said they would call to them and draw them to them. Now picture that for a second. You've just bought a home, you haven't even started your new life there yet, and somebody is already talking about your children as if they belong in the story too. Now, that's not just creepy, that's personal. And once fear becomes personal, it spreads fast. Now, the first letter did more than threaten the family. It told them that someone knew enough about the house to talk about its age, its layout, and the changes happening inside. It arrived almost immediately after the sale, and even though the house had not been sitting there with a giant public sale sign out front for months, within days someone knew the Woods family had moved out and someone new was moving in. And the writer also knew contractors were already working at the house. Now that changes how you think about the threat, because now it doesn't feel random, it feels local, it feels close. And that's where the real psychological damage begins, because when someone convinces you they're watching, you start watching too. You start checking the street, the hedges, the porch, the windows, the neighbors, the parked cars, the person who looked your way for a second too long. This is one of the reasons stalking cases affect people so deeply. The person doing the watching doesn't need to physically appear all the time. They only need to make you feel like they could. Now, after getting that first letter, Derek and Maria contacted the sellers, John and Andrea Woods, and they asked whether they had any idea who this person might be. And the Woodses said that they had received a letter too, but theirs came only a few days before they moved out, after 23 years of living there. And they described it as strange rather than deeply threatening. Now, that detail opens up a lot of questions. If the writer had only been watching the house for generations, why wait until the Woods family was leaving to make contact? Why stay silent for so long and then suddenly begin writing when ownership changed? Now, maybe the house changing hands was the trigger. Maybe the new family was the trigger. Maybe the renovations were the trigger. Or maybe the entire family tradition story was exaggerated on purpose to make the writers seem larger, older, and more powerful than they really were. And that matters too, because the Watcher's not just a name. It was a persona, a role. And the writer wasn't only threatening the family, they were building a myth around themselves. And when someone turns themselves into a myth, it makes them harder to imagine as ordinary. And that gives the fear more room to grow. So the Broadduses reported to the police, and the Westfield police began looking into the case. And early suspicion and reporting focused in part on the Langford family, who lived next door and had been on that block for a long time. Now, Michael Langford, one of the adult sons in that family, was discussed because of his proximity to the house and because someone thought that, maybe he could fit the idea of someone who might know the property well. But nothing ever tied him conclusively to the letters, and the family denied involvement. Now, that's one of the reasons this story feels so unsettling. The possible suspect was never some shadowy figure from far away. The possible suspect pool was the neighborhood and the people living right there, and the people waving hello, the people who knew the house before the Broadduses did. And once that happens, normal life starts to twist. A neighbor's curiosity no longer feels innocent. A comment at a gathering no longer feels casual, and a person standing too long at the curb no longer feels harmless. The safest places in life depend on ordinary things feeling ordinary, and the Watcher took that away. And about 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived, and this one was worse. It was addressed directly to Mr. and Mrs. Broaddus, misspelling their last name. Now, that misspelling itself is interesting because it felt as though the writer had heard the name spoken but not necessarily seen it written correctly. And this second letter said the workers had been busy and mentioned the family unloading carfuls of belongings. It noted the dumpster outside, then it moved back to the children. The writer said that they knew the names of the young blood and the family that the family had brought. And the letter named the children in the correct birth order, and by the nicknames Maria had been yelling outside when she called them. This is one of the most chilling details in the entire case. This person either heard those names from close by or learned them in some other way that still felt far too close for comfort. Now, the second letter also mentioned seeing one of the children painting on an easel inside an enclosed porch and asked, "Is she the artist in the family?" And later, when Derek walked a detective around the property, he showed that the easel was hard to see from the street because of vegetation. That suggested the writer may have been standing very near the house or watching from an angle next door or behind it. And then the letter got darker. It said the house was anxious for the family to move in. It asked whether the children would play in the basement. It said if the parents were upstairs, they would never hear them scream. It asked who would have which bedroom so the writer could plan better. Now, this is not vague menace anymore. This is a targeted psychological violence. The writer was using the actual rooms of the house as weapons. The basements, the bedrooms, the hallways, those are not just parts of a floor plan. Those are the places where family life happens. So once someone names those places in a threatening way, home doesn't feel like home anymore. And the language in the letters is one of the most reasons this case became so famous. It is strange, theatrical, obsessive, and at times almost childish. The house is spoken about as if it's alive. The writer says the house is anxious, the house is crying, the house wants young blood. The writer describes running through the rooms in the past and imagining life with rich occupants there. Now, that could be important for a few reasons. It may suggest someone with a deep emotional fixation on the house itself. It may suggest someone angry about change, like renovations, wealth, outsiders, or the feeling that the house's history was being erased. Or it may simply suggest someone who understood that if they had made the host feel alive, they could make the threat feel impossible to escape. Because a person you can lock out, a house you live in, and that's different. So if the threat feels like it's inside the walls, then there's nowhere in the home that feels truly clean or safe. And that's the kind of fear that's extremely powerful. Now, after the first letters, Derek canceled a work trip. Maria became anxious when the children were at the property, and she would yell their names when they wandered toward corners of the yard. And at one point, the family's contractor found that a heavy sign he had pounded into the front yard had been ripped out overnight. Now, there was also a moment at a neighborhood gathering when someone used the phrase young blood in a completely ordinary way, saying it would be nice to have some in the neighborhood. But because the phrase had already appeared in the letter, Derek reportedly froze. And that detail may sound small, but it tells you a lot. This is what happens when someone succeeds in getting inside your head. Normal language no longer sounds normal. Harmless interactions begin to feel loaded, and the mind starts connecting everything back to the threat. And that's why being watched is so psychologically corrosive. You don't just fear the person, you begin fearing your own interpretation of everyday life. Now, several weeks after the second letter, a third letter arrived. By that point, Derek and Maria had stopped bringing the children to the house. They were no longer sure whether they would move in at all. The third letter began with a line that was quiet, but deeply unsettling. Where have you gone to? 657 Boulevard is missing you. Now that line is important because it means the writer noticed they were staying away. Even their absence was being observed, and that deepens the trap. So if you go to the house, you may be watched. And if you avoid the house, that too may be watched. There's no private move left. And once that happens, a person starts feeling trapped even when they leave. Now, the Broadduses eventually sued the Woods family, arguing that the previous owners should have disclosed the earlier letters that had arrived. And that suit did not end the way the Broadduses hoped. They also explored other ways to deal with the house, including trying to sell it and later trying to have the property subdivided so the house could be torn down and the lot split into 2 new homes. Well, the Westfield Planning Board rejected that proposal after a long, heated meeting. Now, this part of the story often gets missed, but it matters. The Watcher did not just frighten a family. Whoever wrote those letters managed to damage them financially too. The Broadduses paid the mortgage, taxes, utilities, contractors, lawyers, investigators, and the emotional cost of owning a house they never fully truly got to live in. And Reeve Weidman's reporting said they ultimately lost roughly $400,000 on the sale even before other costs were fully counted. And that changes how you think about the motive, because if the point was to force them out, punish them, make them bleed money, or prove control over that house, the letters were effective. No one had to break in. No one had to physically attack them. The family was still driven out. This is a frightening level of power for an unseen person to have. Now, a lot of the people stopped telling the story after the first 3 letters, but the case did not fully end there. Years later, after the house had been rented out, another letter arrived. Reporting from the cut says there was more than 2 years after the earlier letters. One dated on February 13th arrived and opened with, "To the vile and spiteful Derek and his wench of a wife, Maria." It mocked the couple, referred to the legal battle, and again leaned into the idea that the writer might be someone around them saying, "You wonder who the Watcher is? Turn around, idiots." Now, this is a meaningful detail because it shows the obsession had not necessarily burned out quickly. The writer was still paying attention to the family's conflict, to the public story, and to their anger. This was not just one burst of creepy letters and then silence. At least for a while, the fixation continued. Now, the case never produced the kind of hard answer people wanted. Police investigated, the family hired private investigators, a former FBI profiler was consulted. Reporting also says DNA from one envelope pointed to a female source, but it did not solve the case. And years later, the Union County Prosecutor's Office restarted work on the case and collected voluntary DNA samples from neighbors, but no match was found, and the case remained unsolved. Now, this is one of the reasons why the story stays alive. There were details, there were suspects, there were theories, and there was evidence, but none of it locked together cleanly. And when a case feels almost solvable, but never quite gets there, it becomes hard to let go of. So now we get to the part that makes the story even more fascinating. What kind of person writes letters like this? And the honest answer is we don't really know, because the writer was never identified. But the letters themselves suggest possibilities. And one possibility is territorial obsession. Now, the writer may have seen the house as something symbolic, not just a building, but something they believed they had a relationship with. Something like that may resent ownership, changing hands. They may resent renovations. They may resent wealth, status, or the feeling that the wrong kind of people are now living in a place they have built up in their mind. Now, another possibility is voyeuristic control. The letters return again and again to the same idea. I see you. I know where you are. I know what your children are doing. I know your routines. I know your house. This kind of obsession is not always about direct physical violence. Sometimes it's about power through observation, and it's about being hidden while making someone else feel exposed. So that imbalance can be intoxicating for the wrong person. Why? Because they stay unknown, you become known. They feel powerful, you feel helpless. Now, another possibility is grievance dressed up as theater. Now, the writer may have had a personal anger that they wrapped up in dramatic language about generations, destiny, and about the house itself. Now, that type of theatrical style can serve a purpose. It makes the writers sound bigger than they are, older than they are, harder to pin down than they really are. And if that was the goal, it worked. The family wasn't just afraid of one angry person. They were afraid of the watcher. And that's a much larger shadow. Now, the watcher fascinates people because it destroys one of the basic promises of home life. A home is supposed to be private. It's supposed to be where public life ends. And this story takes the feeling and flips it. Now the windows are not comforting. They feel like openings. The mailbox is not harmless. It feels like an entry point. And the neighbors are not just neighbors. They become possibilities. And psychologically, that is devastating, because fear does not need to be allowed to be life-changing. This story also taps into something deeper, the terror of not knowing whether your instincts are overreacting or saving you. Now, if you move in, maybe you're putting your children at risk. If you don't move in, maybe you're letting a stranger control your life. And that's a brutal place for a family to live in mentally. And that's why this case stays with so many people. It isn't about just a creepy letter. It's about the collapse of safety. Now, the Broadduses never moved into 657 Boulevard. They eventually sold the property in 2019 for $959,000, which was far below what they paid. And public reporting says the house was sold to another family and no further watcher letters were publicly reported after that, and the case remains unsolved. And that ending may be the creepiest part of all. No arrest, no confession, no final answer, just a house, a family pushed out of it, and a person who proved that words alone can be enough to poison a home. Now, my final thought is this. When people talk about the watcher, they usually ask the same question first. Who wrote the letters? And that matters. But I don't think that's the only reason this story is so powerful. I think what really stays with people is the idea that someone can enter your life without ever stepping through your door. They can live in your mind, in your routines, in your marriage, in your parenting, in the way you look out your own windows. And that's what makes this story so haunting, not the possibility of being watched, but what happens to your mind once you believe you are. Because sometimes the most unsettling things in the world is not a person standing in your house, it's the feeling that they never needed to. Because mystery without discipline becomes misinformation. And here we don't just tell stories. We ask them questions. We break them down and we try to understand what's really going on. From my coast to yours, have a wonderful night.